Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Tryman, and I'm the CEO of NEIBC. NEIBC stands for New England Israel Business Council. It's a not-for-profit organization that its mission is to connect and facilitate business relationship between Israel and the US, primarily Massachusetts. We believe that by facilitating those business relationships, we are making the world a bit better. I would like to thank our four panelists, Karina Rubinstein, Asaf Barnea, Daphna Movitz, and Mati Giel. They're actually representing the depth of the Israeli ecosystem, all the way from government to not-for-profit, to businesses and financing. The four panelists are exceptional professionals and trailblazers of the Israeli bio-convergence revolution. And with that, I would like to hand over the microphone to Asaf Barnea. Asaf, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's dive into the introduction, if that's okay. Would that be okay, Karina, for you to start with a bit of a background about yourself and your scope within the Innovation Authority? It's Karina.
Thank you, Asaf, and thank you, Don, and hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Karina Rubinstein. I'm a business development manager in the Israel Innovation Authority. I joined the authority 4 years ago, and my career before that, for 25 years, I was a business development for Israeli companies in all kinds of verticals and all kinds of stages. Basically, I helped companies reach international markets and develop their businesses. And this is what I bring to the authority. I've been leading the Bio-Convergence strategic program of the authority from a business development perspective for the past, I think, almost 3 years now. And we'll elaborate about that later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Daphna, the 8400 operation, if you please.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Daphna Movitz, co-founder and CEO of the 8400 Health Network, coming with a background of multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral leadership, both in the high-tech and the no-tech and the services and some of the government. And that allowed me to join Dr. Yair Shindel, Marius Nacht, Itzik Bash, Yuval Kabili, and start the 8400 network, envisioning a different type of Israeli health tech, elaborating on that later on. Good to see you all.
Thank you, Daphna. And Mati, to you, please.
Thank you, Asaf and Dan and everyone else, and good morning. My name is Mati, originally from Ohio, but I've been living in Israel for the past few decades. And I'm the CEO of a new innovation lab, which is a partnership between 4 global pharma companies, AWS, and a venture capital firm called Israel Biotech Fund, supported by the Israeli government and the Israel Innovation Authority and Digital Israel program as part of the Bio-Convergence program. And we will be actively looking to start 4 to 6 new companies every year, in which we would love all of you to try to come and join us in that place, move to Israel and be founders in a new startup in our lab. So we'll be elaborating that in just a bit.
Beautiful, thank you. And just a sentence about myself. I'm running Sanara since inception. Sanara started as a joint venture of Philips and Teva 7 years ago. I've been the chairman of the Life Science Board in the Israeli Export Institute for the last 5 years. I've been helping the World Bank, the venture capital team of the World Bank, up till a few years ago as a business advisor to their operation in Israel as well as in growth markets. So I get to do a lot of innovation in healthcare with startups on the VC community on the corporate community, governments, and as well as others. If I may start with you, Karina, to some extent, we became familiar with bioconvergence, the meaning of bioconvergence in Israel due to a marvelous work that you guys did in the Innovation Authority, actually initiating that concept. But to make sure that everybody is on the same page, why don't you please give us a brief of what do we mean by bioconvergence and some examples that we can figure it out?
So yes, so Mati is sharing the presentation here, but you can move on to the next slide, maybe Mati, and it will elaborate more. I think the next one even. But basically, what we were thinking about back then in the authority is that the world is moving through a change of intersection between sectors, or crossing the silos, as they say. And we identified that the medical world, or the healthcare solutions, are moving towards a more precise, personalized medicine. This is not such a news. We think that Israel have major strengths in bringing in the successful high-tech industry that we have here into the medical field and turning it into a more agile, more precise solutions across the board. Basically, we look at how do we intersect between engineering areas, can be 3D printing, physics, AI, machine learning, advanced materials, nanotechnology, and all of that combined with biology areas. And these kinds of solutions would be the way the healthcare solutions would look like in the nearest future. We already in this process as we go, because the world in the corona times have shown by itself that we need to expedite the way that we develop new novel therapeutics and so on. And this is already a reality, not something that we envisioned. However, when we talked about it 4 years ago, it was still a kind of a blurred idea. We are now already in this reality, sadly, within the circumstances, but this is already in the going. And Israel has a very developing stage ecosystem with cutting edge technologies coming out of startup companies here in Israel. With the good help with all of my colleagues here in the panel, Mati with the Ion Lab activity, Asaf with the Sanara incubator activity and the venture capital that they run, and Daphna with all the network of the leadership from these areas. So this is really a very good platform for Israel to lead this cluster or ecosystem in the areas of bioconvergence, which will be not only in health, by the way, but also in other areas that we see crossing the silos. It can be areas of cellular meat, alternative proteins, and whatever relates to energy, for example, agrotech technologies and such on. So we see the intersection between these areas coming in from all kinds of ways and areas, and this is the future already in the going.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on the slides, or we can go on?
So yeah, well, I think I think the slide is not updated really, because I think we are already in the more expedited way processes now, and what was 2 years ago took 10 days now takes a couple of hours maybe. So this is what I was saying. We are already in a process, in an ongoing process of these technologies coming into reality, and their needs and their requirements are really piling up. So we need more companies and cutting edge technologies coming out from Israel. and capturing the markets. And this is the potential market that was envisioned back then by McKinsey, by the way, already is in the happening. It's going to be a huge market.
If I may just interrupt while going through the slides, would that be right to say that the Innovation Authority actually kind of brought a new concept, which was out there mostly on academy research that was done and came up with a very nice integration and a concept to integrate and to find the unique verticals within that? Because some people are surprised. Initially, they've been saying, what do we mean by bioconvergence? Is that new, or is that totally something that we've been seeing? So is it actually a combination of the two?
So I think it's a combination of all kinds of things. Basically, I think from our side, what we saw back then is a very strong maybe progress from ICT or high-tech or engineering areas into the more known areas of bio-pharma, let's say, or medtech. And this is the way the world would be, a combination of these areas coming in from high-tech, AI, ICT, and so on. So the strength of Israel is already there. Also, as you mentioned, Asaf, for sure, in academia here in Israel. What we saw back then is these capabilities that Israel has to offer, and actually the integration between all of these, as you can see on the slide here. But I think, looking at it, and this slide actually is maybe showing it in a better way. How do we look at today at treating diseases from a technology point of view? How do we look at it 360 degrees? So how do we utilize technologies, these kinds of early cutting edge technologies that can be the ones that would serve early detection of diseases and then diagnosing them, treating them, giving a more personalized and precise treatment to patients. I think the way that we look at diseases now have changed dramatically in the past years. All of these technologies are based on the integration between engineering and biology. And all of these that are mentioned here are coming out of it.
Karina, did you find it actually kind of bringing a new concept on behalf of the government, how you stream it down to the industry? How you actually, did you run a campaign? Did you seminars that were conducted? How often did you kind of push the message across till it was captured by the industry?
So we started back then, end of 2019, just before the COVID, I think it was. But we put a lot of energy and a lot of activities were done back then. Just to name a few, as you can see on the slide, but we were doing a lot of activity around promoting the academic projects here in Israel, and also joining up with international academia, joining up between industry and academia to have more maybe the future of technologies coming out of that kind of activity. Also putting in a new kinds of research institutes like the Synthetic Biology Research Institute, which is already operating now, and promoting projects from ideation phase, innovation lab like Ion Lab, that we had an open tender back then, new incubators that we have now an ongoing tender for, and also promoting it quite intensively with 8400. Also a course that we've done with 8400 in Bio-Convergence, so we would have future leadership coming in and entrepreneurship. Now we have already the the third Bio-Convergence course coming in shortly. And we promoted quite extensively international collaborations with countries like South Korea, Denmark, Singapore, also with the US, with many organizations like the WIS Institute and all kinds of other ones like Mayo Clinic, Jefferson, Hartford, and so on. And this is still ongoing. I mean, these kinds of effort we have begun back then. On the going now, we are on the verge of signing an international collaboration agreement now. It would be on the papers tomorrow, so this is a first off, but on Bio-Convergence, but there will be many more. And again, these kinds of activities would be even broader in the next coming years. We are now on the verge of finalizing a national program in Bio-Convergence that will be a joint collaboration between us and the Israel Innovation Authority and other government ministries. So the government of Israel will be putting a lot of budget and efforts in promoting it as a growth engine for Israel.
We shall touch later on the government support, the unique support which has been given to Bio-Convergence, the criteria to be supported with a definition of Bio-Convergence. Thank you, Karina. If that's okay, I'd like to present a little bit. Once it was initiated by the Innovation Authority, we as Sanara, when we have decided to dive into investment, I would say more complicated investments than we typically do on the medical devices side. It took us quite a long time to dive into research institution, in the Weizmann Institution, technical institution, hospitals, and others. And eventually we came up with a portfolio of 5 companies that all could be defined as Bio-Convergence. And as a venture capital fund, I'd like to share with the audience some of our investment and the way we go about those investments, the risk associated with that. But maybe a few slides, Mati, if you can help me on who we are initially. So as I said in the beginning, we started back in 2015, Sanara, as a joint venture of Philips and Teva, investing in seed stage companies with about $1 million or $1.5 million. 3 months ago, we've launched also Sanara Capital, which is our follow-up fund, a $100 million fund. Philips and Teva, as you may know, we've been investing in technologies in digital health, medical devices, and Bio-Convergence. Mati, you can move on to the next slide. But basically, Philips has become a health tech company as of 6 years ago. And Teva, despite the crisis that they're going through now, it's still the largest generic pharma company worldwide. So in some of our investment, we're trying to be synergistic to their wish list. In some of our investment, we merely invest in disruptive technologies for financial returns, not necessarily for strategic value. If we move to the next slide, what we are looking and rooted in the heart of the Israeli innovation ecosystem, we are, and my team, I have a team of about 10 people that are constantly looking for disruptive technologies. One of our projects and one of our Bio-Convergence project, led by Professor Uri Sivan at the bottom, who is the president of the Technion Institution. He's a physicist, and this is a good combination of physics and biology touching one another. This is a company called OneCell, which we have invested a few years ago. And maybe another collaboration that we have is with the second largest hospital in Israel called Sorotsky Hospital in Tel Aviv, the Ichilov, as you may know, which we have signed a special partnership agreement with the neurology department led by Professor Nir Giladi for whatever deal flows that come on the neurology side for anything that has to do with CNS, degenerative diseases, movement disorders, and the like. Moving on to some of the companies and the diverse portfolio that we have. The next slide, we shall actually present, Mati, if we can move to the next slide. When we have invested in those companies and have been investing now, we've been seeing those with a great barrier to entry. And in many cases, in some digital health, and this is maybe one of the potential within the Bio-Convergence, there's a kind of a huge barrier to entry. As investor, we would like to see a strong IP and a barrier to entry. And this is actually years of research that were translated to a specific medical need and a use case. And what we define as an open ocean, blue ocean, not so much competitive in the sense that other investors may look into maybe some more kind of crowded areas. So let's go to the companies that we have invested in and the potential in them. One of which is a company called Sherman Diagnostic that we have invested in. Everybody's talking about the diagnostic becoming popular now because of COVID-19, and it does happen. It's a cyclical nature of venture capital investment. But actually, this is a technology that takes physics and biology and basically translate it to real-time, almost real-time, like within 1 minute, point of care diagnostic for any pathogens, let it be from germs or let it be from viruses. So almost equivalent, actually equivalent to the PCR. This could be done in any clinics, any point of care, airports, and others with any media that has been taken from the man's body. It could be any liquid, blood, saliva, urine, and others. Quite a fascinating platform technology. And then again, the uniqueness and the ability to identify those pathogens is due to the combination of physics and biology. And this is the IP of the company, almost 10 years of research out of the Hebrew University by Professor Sherman, who came to us. So this is one. Another example that we have invested in is a company called NanoDrops. Then again, this is a company that we have invested in from the Bar-Ilan University, led by Professor Zalevsky, who is a very known serial entrepreneur in Israel. The idea here is actually to put drops in your eyes to replace lenses and glasses. It sounds like science fiction, and it is actually. The idea is to have a correction to each and every one specifically tailored to his creating a pattern on the cornea with a small laser flash, doesn't hurt, doesn't cause any pain. And then actually to insert the drops into the eyes to create another lens, but also to maintain the correction which was done previously. We hope that eventually people will go to CVS every 3 or 4 weeks or to Walmart Optics and put some drops in your eyes and without the need to use lenses and glasses. Totally science fiction, but we've been seeing some other drops corrections companies that are replacing lenses and glasses. It's becoming now a new trend in ophthalmology. Maybe the last 1 or 2 companies before we move on to Daphna. Mati, if you can move on to the next one. This other investment of ours, not this one, the one before, is called the OncoDecipher. It's actually a combination of a software after a long research in the Tel Aviv University and allowing pharma company to expand the target population which is being treated by immunotherapy due to a unique algorithm which can identify the outcomes of silent mutations in cancer, and allow pharma companies then again to broaden their scope of treated patients. Last company that I'd like to share with you, and then again, this is the beauty of biology and physics, is a company called Lucid for brain aneurysm. 1 out of 20 people, unfortunately, mostly people recognize it with a stroke situation, but what is causing the stroke is an aneurysm, let it be in the brain. In some cases, obviously, it could happen also in the chest and other places. But brain aneurysm, typically, if they do being found on time, they do repeat themselves. So this technology is actually a unique stent that can radiate. And actually with the radiation, this is the physics component, actually can create the thickening of the blood vessels, and with that to shut down the blood vessel totally. Professor Elazar Edelman, as you guys may have met him or know him quite personally from Harvard, is part of our board, and Professor Vitor Mendez is part of the advisory board of the company. So what I was trying to refer within those companies is that actually the unique technology, the disruption is coming in from the combination of physics and biology that is leading the disruption, and hopefully for unique solutions. So this was my examples of some of our investment, regardless to our investments in digital health and other portfolio companies that we have within Sanara. Daphna, if I go to you now, and if you will, please just tell us, how did you accept and embrace within the ecosystem the Bio-Convergence concept within the 8400 operation?
Thank you, Asaf, and thank you for Karina for setting this talk about the Bio-Convergence. So really what we're talking about is a health tech ecosystem that is now very much focused on the convergence of the different disciplines And this is something that it does not only have to impact tremendously and dramatically the Israeli economy and as a growth nation, as a growth engine, but rather to really be able to accelerate that globally. Mati? In order to do that, we all had to, first of all, take into consideration that we have a very strong and known, globally known, innovation and technology setup here in Israel. And I don't have to tell the audience of this group about the world-class universities, about the high-tech clusters, about STEM being so strong in Israel and the elite military. But when coming to focus a growth engine around the health tech, we did take into consideration and understanding that the excelling public healthcare ecosystem here with two very large health organizations, HMOs, the Clalit and Maccabi, were a global digital health asset. There is a very strong national policy which is providing outstanding platforms for rapid proof. And you can see, you can hear one of the leading ministries for growth, the Israeli Innovation Authority, which is joining the Digital Israel and the Ministry of Health, together with the Prime Minister's office and together with the Ministry of Finance. All this is really creating a government strategy that the investment in digital and bioconvergence is very much accelerated. Mati? So when looking whether the feasibility of accelerating a bioconvergence approach and converging disciplines and converging technologies from different areas, obviously the attractiveness of the ecosystem in Israel is supported by both research organizations, by academic organizations, and as said before, by healthcare organizations and government. So with that in mind, when we started, Mati, when we started 8400, a bit before the bioconvergence focus of the Israeli government, we were addressing an untapped opportunity. By all means, cyber and IT were not only a growth engine in Israel, but also a world leader in the global market. But as the global market for cyber IT was estimated at $150 billion, the health tech market was estimated back then at $10.5 trillion. By all means, an untappedness for, at least from the point of view of Israel, of a whole ecosystem that is taking a very, very small and insignificant part from the global opportunity. And that's where 8400 was, just a minute, Mati, that's where 8400 was created by Dr. Yair Shindel, Marius Nacht, Itzik Dvash, Yuval Kabeli, and myself, with a vision that built on the human and digital assets of Israel. We not only can cater for a strong economic growth engine in Israel, but also accelerate the global cure. But when we're talking about growth engine, and when we're talking about growth engine focused on bioconvergence, we have to take into consideration that we really want to shift the curve up, not only by addressing inefficiencies of regulation or financing or talent. This is all very much called for, but in order to top that and to really triumph over the diminishing marginal return, we really have to see a lot of collaboration, spillovers, and innovation. And that's, as Karina mentioned, the health tech and the bioconvergence approaches really expand the healthcare life science ecosystem tremendously, because it really counts in and then creates the potential for collaboration across all disciplines and sectors. When we, you can click on, thanks. When we looked at the opportunity on one hand and said, okay, so how can we address that opportunity? There were all kinds of many different ways to approach that. What we did is, and instead of taking the philanthropic money that was invested in founding and running 8400 for the first 2 years, taking that money, going to one of the amazing strategic consultancy companies and asking for a report saying, let's see what the gaps and opportunities of the Israeli healthcare life science industry and ecosystem, how can we address them? And there would be yet another report, and then it will have some recommendations, etc. We said we're going to do the opposite way. We're going to year by year add to a very focused, goals-focused and target-focused active network of leaders from across the ecosystem, from the Translational Academy, from tech transfer offices, from the industry, from peers providers, health organizations and HMOs, from other NGOs that are active, and from the government. We're going to take the leaders of all these different silos and create one think tank and action tank that is focused on the vision of 8-400. What was beautiful about that is that very quickly, leaders from the Israel Innovation Authority that took part in both in the first cohort at the end of 2017 and at the second cohort in 2018 and 19, they could both use the network and the infrastructure that was created within the 8-400, but then alongside the strategies that we're developing in the different government offices, we're really able to lead this really very innovative approach, which focuses on the unique value proposition of Israel. Mati, can you skip? I think yeah, let's skip that. Okay, so what we did in order really to support a very thriving healthcare industry and health tech industry, what we did is created this model. It's not rocket science, but it really works. We year by year add to this network a group that goes through a fellowship, a very tailor-made leadership program, which is also in collaboration with Harvard Business School and other key opinion leaders globally. And what we do is we combine the people, a lot of peer learning, and an incubator of infrastructural projects, which really close gaps in opportunity, which really close gaps within the opportunity to grow. Mati? And I think that one of the focuses, and there was a question in the chat before regarding, so how does Israel impact not only locally, but also globally, and how does it address the challenges of globalization of the Israeli IP, which is obviously strong and big in quantities. So the 8-400 network really focuses on two main scale-up opportunities. One is the different government offices, different government ministries, that their strategy is aligned and our strategy is aligned with them. And that's where in the past 2 years, we've been part of a joint venture led by the Israel Innovation Authority and Digital Israel and the Ministry of Health in order really to create this accelerated crew and growth engine. But not less importantly, what our focus is really to expand and extend the global community of key opinion leaders and key industry leaders that are leading the healthcare and life sciences different ecosystems globally, and get them to be a much more greater part and greater collaborators with the Israeli industry. And just to finish this part, Asaf asked, so how does one create this new implementation of the approach that the Israeli government has really highlighted and focused us on? And I think that when you take the people and when you create the language, when you have the tools, when you are all focused on really bringing the curve up, then not only do you tackle inefficiencies, but you also create a lot of spillovers and collaborations that without this type of network learn create, establishing specific ways to overcome barriers that are usually barriers across silos or barriers across sectors. This is something that people can lead, and that's where the 8-400 leadership program and leadership network impacts Israel on a large scale.
And if I just may If I just may add, this is my own impression and gratitude for you guys, as well as to the Innovation Authority, as being alumni of the 8400 and understanding and sharing the impact that you guys created the last few years. This is a marvelous job. Thank you for that. Matti, if that's okay, I'd like to go to you, to Ion's lab, and basically to understand how, first of all, it's very interesting concept of having like 5 pharma companies. Definitely, sorry, did you miss some of the slides? Do you want to still go on that, or?
No. I think we'll continue, and if there'll be questions, I might have slides that answer their questions. No, we're fine. Matti and I are completely in sync.
Okay, beautiful. So let's go to Ion Labs, and Matti. Then again, you guys, I mean, this is not typical to have Pfizer, Merck, AstraZeneca, Teva, of course, combine into an effort of Ion Labs. So, how did this concept materialize? And acknowledging your role in the innovation of Teva and supporting Sanara throughout the years, tell us a bit about the process, and later on to touch the Bio-Convergence within your operation.
Well, I could say, first of all, that it all started from me learning a lot from you when I served on the board of Sanara Ventures. But with all seriousness, and I'm very serious about that, but it started with the Israel Innovation Authority's Bio-Convergence strategy. And they were really the catalyst in gaining the interest of these global pharma companies and AWS and IDF of conducting investments in Israel and furthering their investments in the R&D field in Israel, in the areas where Israel can play a competitive role towards the future of pharma R&D, which is in the areas of bioconvergence, and specifically in our Ion Labs Innovation Lab, in the areas where AI and all computational technologies can help accelerate the way that we discover and develop new drugs. And that's what we are doing in Ion Labs. In Ion Labs, we are focused on taking as much of the cycle of developing and discovering new drugs, which can be a very laborious process, as we all here know, and costs billions of dollars in multi-years, and taking as much of that process and empowering scientists to be able to discover new ways to discover new drugs and develop new drugs in faster, more precise, and more accelerated manners, using computational technologies in a bioconvergent structure. And the reason why we're all working together is because of the systematic dysfunction that exists within the area of AI-based drug discovery and development companies, where you have the technology companies that are excellent at bringing the tech to be able to accelerate new ways to discover medicines and to develop new technologies. But for them to be successful specifically in the biopharma world, they need to have access to what the needs are of the industry, and that's specifically within the pharma industry and within the pharma companies at a global scale. And then, so they need to have access to what the needs are and what the problems and challenges are. They need to have access to the wide scope of data from human trials and from clinical trials that, again, is accessible within the pharma companies, and it's within the pharma companies that you can find that data beyond the regularly available public data, as well as the capability to then validate and implement their technologies. And the way we are working in Ion Labs, and again with the support of the ecosystem here, is combining the capabilities of 4 pharma partners that decided they wanted to come and work together, Teva, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Merck, all as equal partners, both in the ownership of the lab and an investment of the 20 startup companies that we're going to create and invest in over the next 5 years. These 4 pharma companies came with their global R&D and global leadership support, with AWS as a computational partner, so that they're working in a synergetic manner from day one between the tech leadership and pharma leadership. Together with Israel Biotech Fund, that is an excellent American-Israeli venture capital firm specifically focused on Israeli biotech and only on Israel, with the support and commitment of the government. And BioMedX, which is an innovation engine that we brought their innovative model from Germany, led by Dr. Christian Tidona, that they've been working for the past decade with global pharma on a challenge-based innovation model, which I'll describe in just a second, but tapping into, with the support of 8400 and of other NGOs and ecosystem leaders and the government, of course, led by the Israel Innovation Authority, with their support to be able to help tap into the talent base that exists in Israel, but also competing for global talent very actively. And on our leadership, we do have the active support of the global leaders, both of the R&D and business development of all of our pharma and AWS partners that came and recognized in a very evident manner that the time to be able to accelerate AI-driven drug discovery and development, and the place is in Israel. And they chose Israel, and we're very proud of doing that. And as you can see, and as Asaf and Karina and Daphne mentioned before, there is a great emerging cluster of AI-based drug discovery and development for companies that are starting to grow. Many of them have been through the 8400 program, and a great group of global companies, both within the Ion Labs partners, but also from outside of our partnership, and startups that are tapping into the Israeli capabilities in the technology space of the Bio-Convergence area. At Ion Labs specifically, what we are going to do over the next 5 years, at least, we are going to build 4 to 6 new platform companies in the AI for drug discovery and development space. And we're going to do that working in 2 tracks to be able to generate deal flow. Again, we are trying to focus first on what is the challenge that the industry is facing. So we are focused on working with our pharma R&D partners at a global scale to do an ideation process where we select 4 challenges every year, 4 large, impactful research challenges that if they are solved through using computational and AI-driven technologies, it will have a major impact on patients and on the industry at a global scale. We launch each one of those challenges on a quarterly basis globally to find talents and to call for applications from scientist founders from around the world. And then in a very systematic manner, our partners help us to invite those finalists to a boot camp that takes place in Israel. Of course, in Israel, everything has to be in military terms, so we do it in a boot camp in Israel. The first one will be taking place in about 3 weeks in Tel Aviv at AWS offices. And then once we select the startup founding team that our partners select that team, they then offer them up to 4 years with funding, access to data, systematic mentoring from R&D experts of each one of our partners, as well as all the AWS technology and cloud support. In addition to that, in a similar manner to what Asaf described before that's worked well with Sonara, we are very open to open innovation technologies, ideas that will come from academia and from Israel and from abroad, that we can then offer them the same support. And what we do is we will be creating these 5 companies in one of 2 manners, either having founders bring their company to Ion Labs, or us coming with the challenge, selecting the founders and then building the company from scratch, and then launching it within Israel, where they have to bring their company and they have to bring their talents. If it's scientists that are coming from outside of Israel, they have to come work in Israel, but in a similar manner that Boston competes and New England competes for global talent. In Israel, we plan to do the same and then work in a cross-geographic manner with all of them. I'm going to skip over this slide, but just to give you 2 examples of the first 2 companies that we're forming. The first is supported by all of our partners, and the bootcamp will take place in 3 weeks. It is in the space of AI for therapeutic antibody generation. And the second one is a challenge that our partners identified, which if solved through AI and computational technologies could have a major impact on the industry, which is developing an artificial intelligence-based platform to check drug candidates before they enter into the clinical phases, which are the most high risk and also most laborious and expensive area of drug discovery, drug development, is to develop an AI-based platform using the data of our pharma partners on the AWS capabilities to then be the artificial intelligence-based platform that will check each drug candidate before they go into the clinical trial, to help pharma companies around the world, both from within Ion Labs and beyond, to take decisions based upon data on which will have the higher risk which drug candidates have a higher risk of being toxic or not being effective. And we're going to do this by taking the input of all the multiple data sets of all types of data and being able to develop a program that will then be able to predict which will have a high probability of not being toxic, of being safe, and with a high predicting which one will be efficient, so that we can have a major impact on the way that and the cost of which we develop new drugs. And with that, we have taken that global. It's active on our website. You can come on our website and come on our LinkedIn page and look for that. And basically, you can find that global call for applications. And we expect not just bio-pharma scientists to compete for that call for application, but are actively going to high-tech engineers, because you don't need to have a biology training to develop that AI platform. So we are actively talking with entrepreneurs from Israel and from around the world that might have been working in the gaming industry or the fintech industry, but want to go into biotech and have an impact on global health and on the way that we discover new drugs and develop new drugs. And for me, that's very exciting to be able to bring those type of people into the health tech industry. And that's what we're actively trying to do.
This is an amazing achievement, Matti, and I have to give you credit also for formalizing that. This is one of the things that I've been pushing the last few years, is knowledge sharing in a more structured way. And one of my examples, repeated examples that I've been talking to the Ministry of Health and others in the local and global ecosystem, is a company out of Norway, actually, called Indac, that connects 81 hospitals in Norway. And once there's innovation being implemented in one of the hospitals for, let's say, reducing diagnostic of breast cancer from 12 weeks to treatment within 1 week, they did share it with 80 other hospitals of the, the gold standard and the best practices that they implemented in their office. So this is just one example of more structured way to do knowledge sharing. And I think this ION Labs is an amazing example of knowledge sharing, Matti, and truly a great support of whatever you achieved, and bringing together those pharma companies. It's another example for that, and best of luck on that effort. I'm heading to the questions which we've been seeing a little bit, Karina, and going back to you. Actually, one of the questions that we had over the chat is saying that back in the 50s, there was a concept initiated in the US with bringing in engineers and researchers and universities and others, and creating the bioengineering concept. So one of the questions that came out from the audience is actually, what is the difference between bioengineering and bioconvergence?
I think basically the new concept, first of all, we are in different era. The opening now for new technologies and the computational costs, and the fact that we can run DNA sequences and so on in a fraction of a cost, and it's really a different kind of a landscape altogether. So the capabilities are totally different. And that said, we are looking at how engineering and biology collide in the R&D processes of a company. Not necessarily in the end product, but right from the beginning, how do you combine these different sectors into the DNA of a company? And Matti has given all kinds of examples here, USF as well, of how does it work, but it wasn't the same in the 50s. We are in a different, completely different era now. I think we moved with the high tech for sure decades on, and the health tech industry also moved, and it's time for the two of them to join up forces together now. In this time of this point of time, I think it's a totally different concept than it used to be in the past. From the side of the technology abilities, I can say, first off, that it wasn't like that in the 80s nor in the 90s, and we are in completely different times now.
Cool, thank you. And Dafna, referring to the next question to you is actually one of my questions initially is, is in terms of scaling, and I would like to combine with a question that came out of the audience. I think Tali Hirsch asked it. This is saying basically that whatever has been working in Israel, not necessarily is going to work in the US. I mean, Israel is known to be kind of a lab innovation which been created in Israel may have been tested and validated in the Israeli local kind of community, the healthcare community, but it's a total different game out there in the US. So what does it take in order to be able to scale companies, Bio-Convergence specifically, with a bit more complicated, which are not necessarily digitalized in their concept and not necessarily naturally could be scaled as digital health, to take them globally and mostly to the US market for that matter?
Thank you, Asaf. So one of the people here in the audience is heading one of the projects that came out of 8-400 within this incubator of the Create pillar. And I think that the most important thing is connecting the ecosystem, meaning not just having investors or only merely having a combined research or even combined development, but really having people from the global market and specifically from the States who are already leading big companies, pharmas, health tech companies, whether they call themselves Bio-Convergence or not. And if, as much as they tap into the Israeli innovation, but on the other hand, bring into the Israeli innovation the skill set, the toolkit, and the standards of large-scale companies. Once we have that very strong connection, which we work on the global, on the 8-400 global community and global network, that's where cultures, that's where markets, that's where the gap or the distance between the continents really decreases. So it's people, it's really all about people, all about wise money that is brought here. Mati's talking about talent that will be invited to take part in R&D in Israel of Bio-Convergence. So once we minimize the geographical distance, I think that we'll be able to scale much more. Still, we'll have, our goal is to scale up and to increase tremendously the growth of Israeli IP to startup and to growing companies in Israel. But at the end of the day, once the market is abroad, and again, talking about the States here, then the goal is really to increase as much as possible of the growth within Israel, and then having a very smooth scale into the States. So it's people connecting, it's technologies connecting, it's co-investing, it's co-regulation. The Israeli regulator, and again, thanks to collaboration between the different ministries, has defined a goal, has defined an objective for the next 2 years to really scale or really increase or really enhance the regulatory paths in Israel in order to be a much more convening power and a much more convening place, together with a very, very strong healthcare service system here, to companies to increase the number of clinical trials that take here and of co-R&D. So I think it's people, technologies, regulations, and a language, and a common language that is really understanding, whether it's bioengineering from earlier years, bioconvergence, health tech, but really seeing how platforms are enjoying the spillovers of technologies and of sectors.
One of the things that I'd like to share with Mati and later on with Karina as well is a question referring to the export out of Israel. Had been expected, an increase in export, as Mati also shares my role on the advisory and the board of the Export Institute in Life Science. Basically, just to share with the audience, back in 2017, Israel actually was celebrating for the very first time crossing $100 billion of export, total exports. Life Science is a major part of that. Back at the time, it was almost 10%, getting to $9 billion of life science export out of Israel. This is biotech, pharma, medical devices, and digital health. The last 3 or 4 years, we've been seeing an increase in the Israeli export, then again, total export, which is over now $115 billion out of Israel. Great achievement, I have to say. And the life science component actually is still maintained to be between $8 to $9 billion of life science export. And this is our job to push it forward. Mati, you know, in terms of creating and sometimes using the regulation to define a new gold standard, let's say there's a new gold standard technology, for instance, our company from Sanara, Sherman Diagnostic, which can detect pathogens within 1 minute. Typically, Israeli companies were not so much able to play on the regulation side to set the new standards as being away from the market. Do you see that with the companies that have been supporting Ion Labs and others, or potentially regardless to Ion Labs, as us being able to increase our export out of Israel using regulation, using hopefully new gold standards and best practices that may come from bioconvergence solution? Do you really believe that we can create and leverage and hopefully increase our export in the next decade or so with those bioconvergence technologies, or otherwise it may take us 20 years to achieve that goal?
I think if you look at the industry in pharma in the future of where the pharma industry and the biotech industry is headed, it's going to be headed in a place where it's going to be increasingly possible to manage a company and scale up a company from Israel while being able to reach global regulatory approval and then global scale up abroad. If you look at other industries that Israel's been successful in doing this, and before we go into pharma and before we go into health tech, you could see that it's happening. Let's take the automotive industry in Israel. So Israel, for those that know a little bit about Israeli history, Israel's tried, crashed, and failed twice to manufacture cars. We tried doing it with the Susita, which looks like a box on wheels. For those that know it, during the age of the Arab boycott. So many of the global car dealers didn't bring their automotive companies didn't bring their products here to Israel during that time, and we tried to manufacture our own. It wasn't a very successful product. We did the same thing with electric vehicles, well before Tesla, well before Elon Musk decided to take over that area. There was a great company called Better Place, which was excellent at creating the technology, less so at scaling it up commercially to be able to be with a viable business model globally, and probably a little bit ahead of their time in that sense as well. And now, though, despite all that, because of AI technologies and because the automotive industry is increasingly using computational technologies within their products, Israel is having a leading role in scaling up startups and also attracting global leaders in the automotive space in Israel, but not to manufacture cars. And we're probably not going to be a leading company, this is at least in my opinion, a leading country on the global manufacturing scale of drugs, because there are very few global manufacturing sites around centers around the world. Israel is not one of the leading ones, but where you bring in computational capabilities, it's going to be increasingly possible to be able to continue to develop the technologies in Israel, to continue to manage the development of those, and to have the headquarters in Israel, just like in the high-tech industry, where you have a whole group of startup companies that, instead of selling their technologies to global leaders or moving the company from outside of Israel, like Wix, Fiverr, Monday.com, and others, that have decided to continue to grow their technologies in Israel, continue to manage them from Israel. And the manufacturing side, because you're talking about computational, is much less CapEx heavy in that sense. You continue to export those technologies.
So do you see an impact on do you see that, Mati, growing in our export growing in the next decade? Do you see a real impact on bioconvergence export coming out of Israel within the next decade? And then, Karina, it's you. You're representing the government, so please address this as well. Mati, do you believe we shall see an increase within the next 10 years?
By definition, you'll see an increase. Now, if you look at the pharma sector, and if you actually count exports, it's a little tough to really measure that sector, because let's just say the pharma sector over the last decade and a half or 2 decades in Israel, the exports have been heavily reliant on one drug being manufactured by one company. And the more they sold Copaxone for the price that was increasing throughout the years, the exports were raised in that sector. Once Copaxone came off, that was manufactured by Teva, that still is manufactured by Teva. Once Copaxone came off patent, the exports dropped dramatically. I think what you're going to see is a much more balanced approach that will continuously increase as the companies become more and more successful, scale up, but less reliant on just one drug. And that's what you're going to see, a more sustainable and more balanced approach to exports going towards the future, because these companies will be able to continue to operate from Israel and scale up their operations from Israel.
Cool, thank you. Karina, just to integrate, I know you're tempted to address that, but before that, in terms of competition, also if you can address, as well as Daphna later on, the competition that we've been facing, you know, stem cells. China is great on stem cells. I mean, Boston area, we are now talking to the Boston area folks who are amazing, doing an amazing job on a lot of biotechnologies and Bio-Convergence so-called companies. So could you address this competition, the SWOT analysis, if you will, of the Israeli landscape, and then again, your expectation as the Innovation Authority to the increase of export within the next decade?
First of all, just want to resonate to what Mati said about the future companies. We envision a landscape in Bio-Convergence of, a number of unicorns, medium-sized, let's say, companies, but a lot of them. And all of these companies will be developing platform technologies. So they won't be reliant on one, small enhancement of something. They would have a portfolio of new solutions that they could be developing over and over and time. And I think this is more or less the DNA that the companies here in Israel have to develop, because the strengths of these companies will be in that. So this is one thing. I think, stem cells in China, maybe, but what about Israeli stem cells joining with a leading dairy manufacturer in Israel? This is another, it's a different kind of a ball game altogether. Maybe the bio-pharma industry is going towards this direction of cross silos, and there will be a new strength of Israel. I think the joining up between those sectors and silos, this is the future of Bio-Convergence, not only talking about stem cells as stem cells, but stem cells and applications in other areas. So I think bringing in, big manufacturers in Israel from other verticals, joining up with these kinds of new solutions, a different kind of altogether landscape with a competitive edge altogether. I think we shouldn't duplicate other companies. We should be genuine.
And Daphna, in terms of the 8400 operation, how much, if you can share some examples of not necessarily just the US, definitely the US, which is of an interest to this panel for sure, but also potentially other in Asian markets, potentially some, interesting giants that are talking to Israeli companies on the Bio-Convergence side, or some, go-to-market plans of companies that you've been seeing out of the 8400 operation that are focusing on, Brazil or the Chinese market or the Japanese market that you are aware of with those Bio-Convergence and not necessarily just the digital component?
I'm not quite sure I can answer that with specific details, but what I would want to emphasize, and sorry for going back to your previous question, because I think part of the export that Israel can and should and will have seeing a substantial increase will be, as I see it, thanks to creating a much more inviting environment in Israel for collaborations and clinical trials, because I think that we're talking about the uniqueness of the AI and machine learning in Israel, uniqueness of the convergence, but we really can and should tap into the very unique healthcare services in Israel, and both the data that we didn't touch in on this call, but obviously sharing the data among healthcare organizations across Israel, among companies, among startups, with different infrastructure that the Israeli government now, the Ministry of Health, is really encouraging now. One of them is the FHIR standard, the FHIR standard of the API of data sharing. So between data sharing, very strong healthcare services, and a very inviting regulation, I think that we're going to see part of the expert of the Bio-Convergence will be by ways of increasing the clinical trials. So I did want to tap on that. I'm not quite sure I can answer
the geography.
Yeah, the geographies.
No, sure, no worries. So my last question before we're wrapping it up, and this is to each and every one of you, is quite an open one, and starting with you, Dafna, and Karina and Mati. And we've been quite positive on many of the trends and the opportunity for the Israeli companies to rise and scale and be connected to global strategic players. But let's soften that and ask you, Dafna, what are you optimistic about and what are you pessimistic about in the Bio-Convergence space? So share with us also the challenges that you may be afraid of in 2 or 3 sentences, each the optimistic approach as well as the pessimistic approach. Same to you and same to Mati, please.
I'll share a very optimistic approach, and that is that there's zero distance between the Israeli leading ministries, and again, led by the Israeli Innovation Authority and the ecosystem. This is something that is not trivial at all, because there isn't a policy here and the ecosystem there. This distance has been decreased tremendously thanks to the leadership of both the ecosystem and the ministries. So I'm very optimistic because there is zero loss in resources, in focus, etc. Where I'm less optimistic is where we lead, where we might not focus enough, because Karina said, and very rightly so, once talking about bioconvergence, then the healthcare life science ecosystem really is expanded tremendously. It has food tech, and it has agri-tech, and it has climate tech, and all this will be very, very much interdisciplinary together with the healthcare life science. I want to see different organizations or different ministries focus on different outcomes here. I do want to see the impact on accelerating cure globally. And so I'm the only caveat that I have here is let's take it as much as possible in order from our point of view to accelerate global cure and have a growth engine. But if we spread it too much and see everything as part of the bioconvergence, we might miss at least the goals of saving lives.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Karina, please.
Well, I think just to resonate on what Daphna said, we let the market do what it does very good without us, and so I don't know about the trends of the future, but this is already happening. Of course, cure is really important to push forward, but whatever happens around that, not for us to be in the way. However, if I'm going to be more optimistic, I think Israel has a lot to offer. We haven't tapped into the nutshell of it up until now. So the potential is huge. With the help of a government, and this is maybe on the, let's say, a more pessimistic side, we are very hopeful that a national program would be pushed forward in the coming month, and that's going to put bioconvergence on a different scale, because it's not going to be only us, Israel Innovation Authority with our budgets. It's going to be the total government of Israel with the total budget for 5 years at least. So major investments in infrastructure, major investments in pushing forward academia, industry, international collaboration by all means, and a lot of opportunities for that. So in that sense, I'm really hopeful that it's going to happen.
Beautiful, thank you. Mati, please, your thoughts on what I just asked.
Sure. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we face, and I think the industry faces in Israel, is how do we compete for talent and have enough talent that will actually be experienced enough and be able to bring their skill set to be able to help build and work in this industry that's emerging overnight in Israel. And in that sense, I think the government support and also enabling from a policy perspective to programs that bring from high tech over to Israel, over to the biotech space is absolutely important. And also to be able to compete for global talents. It's a challenge because we're also competing for talents that can make much more money in the immediate sense in the high tech space, especially in Israel where salaries are skyrocketing. But we do believe that with the offering of being able to work for positive impact, that's something that we can compete for. And I'm happy that the government in Israel is also being more and more open, increasingly open, to be competing for global talent, which is an area that Israel hasn't played in. If you look at 5%, a lot of Israelis are very proud, and rightfully so, that 5% of California-based unicorns are with Israeli talents, and many more so are based upon talents coming from India, China, and elsewhere. I think in that sense, it should just really symbolize to us how important it is that we bring talents from outside of Israel to help enrich the talent pool in Israel, develop the next generation of Israeli tech entrepreneurs and biotech entrepreneurs that will help the talent pool grow beyond the capabilities of our country, which isn't that small, but it's still not that big. We're only 9 million people in that sense. I think the one thing that, in short, that I'm optimistic about is that next year, or maybe 5 years from now, Dan here is going to host a webinar that's going to show Israel as a leader in climate tech, because they're going to take the same capabilities and the same playbook that they built the Bio-Convergence industry, and Israel's going to play a role not just in accelerating global cure, but also a global cure for our planet. So, and I do believe that Israel's going to do that using the 8400 playbook, the Bio-Convergence playbook of the IIA, and bringing a lot of companies to do a lot of good in Israel in that sense as well.
Thank you for that. If I may add, and I don't want to exempt myself from that challenge as well, from the pessimistic approach. I'm a bit bothered by the fact that bioconvergence technologies may need a lot of capital till they get to the marketplace. So this may take different timelines. As sophisticated as they are, this may require some capital, intensive capital, to be injected into those early stage operation, despite the abilities to do data-oriented and computational approach within that. But nonetheless, on the more biotech side, on the more kind of device bioconvergence side, I think some of those companies may bring some challenges in terms of the capital intensiveness. Nonetheless, I'm quite optimistic that this is with the support of the organs and the support of the government and the support of the local ecosystem and the global ecosystem, I do believe that there's a tremendous opportunity to see those being leveraged and hopefully eventually the bottom line to be able to increase the export out of Israel and hopefully to see those numbers increasing in the next decade or so. With that, I'd like to end and thank you very much, Dafna and Karina and Mati, and definitely Dan for hosting that and setting that up. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and whoever needs some questions or later on, definitely feel free to connect us to that. Dan, if whatever is needed, connect us through emails, and we will be happy to address and reply to whoever is interested. Thank you much and have a good evening.